It's been 2 years, and I have not heard anything.
Failure to investigate.
My story could have been prevented.
I feel betrayed by the people I trusted.
They bungled this.
Failure to prosecute.
We're telling them to trust the system, but yet
They weren't going to press charges. He's already reoffended.
Failure to adopt solutions.
We have taken this to the legislators for 3 years and have failed every time.
What do survivors have to do to get justice?
If this is the best we can do, we need to do better.
One of your clients says that you raped her. Is that true?
Josh, are you going to follow your probation this time?
KSL investigates failure to protect.
Is it acceptable that his neighbors didn't know he was a registered sex offender for more than 500 days?
No, it's not acceptable.
Good evening. I'm Daniela Rivera. The KSL investigators spent 2023 taking a close look at sexual violence in Utah, assaults against women and children, the police investigations into those assaults, the prosecution of offenders or lack thereof, and the systems in place aimed at protecting future victims. Our reporting led to the discovery of multiple wrongfully closed cases, several new rape charges filed against an accused serial predator, the arrest of a wanted fugitive, promised changes to the way Utah's parole board interacts with victims, and an audit of the state's sex offender registry. Tonight, we'll take you through the failures we found in Utah's criminal justice system and the potential solutions that could solve some of those issues. An investigation more than a year in the making revealed Utah's sex offender registry was inaccurate and incomplete, with more than 100 names missing. As a tool that promises to provide Utah families with important information, this discovery had us asking serious questions of the Department of Corrections.
As soon as 2:20 hits, the streets are flooded with kids.
It's a really child-friendly neighborhood.
That feeling of safety and community is why many families choose to live in this Lehigh neighborhood, and parents tell us.
So I've looked at it, even thought of moving to different places.
They do their research.
Come on, you dude. Because it's always good to know as a parent.
Checking Utah's online sex offender and kidnapping registry, which promises the most accurate and timely information.
It is a tool we do rely on.
And it's not just parents. Tamara Higbee has used the registry to map out her jogging routes, and before she got married, to background potential dates.
But I do it to kind of protect myself.
F-R-Y-E-R.
That's why Utahns we spoke with were upset by what the KSL investigators uncovered.
Not on the registry.
That's scary. That is really scary.
More than 100 convicted sex offenders who should have been on the public registry.
0 offenders. Nobody. He's not on the registry.
But were not.
That's not something any parent wants to hear.
And to be sure, we tracked some of them down.
Are you aware that he's not on the registry?
I mean, it kind of makes me sick to my stomach.
We won't be showing you the names and faces of convicted sex offenders tonight. That's because this is not a report about people intentionally skirting the registry. While that does sometimes happen, our investigation found many offenders followed the law and they did register, but the state failed to publish their profiles for the public to see.
It is very important to have it be accurate and up to date.
Dan Blanchard is the Director of Adult Probation and Parole under Utah's Department of Corrections, which is tasked with maintaining the registry. Since our team identified more than 200 convicted sex offenders missing from the registry and requested this interview, at least 112 offenders on our list have been added to the registry, confirming they should have been there all along.
There has been delay.
But these aren't people who are newly convicted. The offenders on our list were sentenced anywhere from a year to even decades ago. Blanchard says as offenders register, their information is available to law enforcement. The delay has been with the public side of the registry, the one Utah families rely on. That's what happened with a man living in this Lehigh neighborhood near an elementary school, sentenced to probation in March of 2022. According to court records, investigators found more than 160,000 files of child pornography on his computer, and he admitted to fantasizing about children he sees in public. Supervision records show he's been updating his registry information as required,
but the public didn't see it. Is it acceptable that his neighbors didn't know he was a registered sex offender for more than 500 days?
No, it's not acceptable. He should have been and shown on the public side of the registry.
The Lehigh man's information popped onto the registry on September 27th, more than a year after our team first alerted the state about offenders missing from the registry. Back in July 2022, the KSL investigators sent the Department of Corrections a list of about 300 names to check. What was done with that list that we provided?
We had some spot checks that were done on that list.
Blanchard says their checks on a sampling of the names didn't turn up significant issues, but a thorough check of the list would have identified the Lehigh man and dozens of others who should have been on the registry more than a year ago. Isn't it the department's job to look at each of those names?
Yes, that's something that we should have done at the time.
The KSL investigators continued looking into what we believed was a problem, spending several months trying to track and independently verify information about people missing from the registry.
How will the Department of Corrections fix this problem?
Our executive director has asked for an internal audit of cases on the registry to look closer at what's happening and provide that information and results back.
Blanchard says the audit should determine where the process is failing and how long the public registry has been incomplete.
So that is our responsibility. We recognize that, and we will improve.
Hurry. I do think it's a little bit of a disservice to the people. It is the safety for our children.
Utahns who rely on the registry to be an accurate source of public safety information tell us
It's frustration. It's anger, and it's kind of a little bit of fear.
They want the state to do better.
Think about how you would feel if you were in that situation, finding out that you're living next to someone that's probably looking at your kid a way that they shouldn't.
And make good on its promises about Utah's sex offender registry.
Do their job. That's it. I mean, that's what we're paying them to do.
In addition to conducting an audit, the Department of Corrections tells us they've hired 4 temporary part-time positions to assist in getting the registry up to date as a result of this reporting. And we now know that audit not only validated what the KSL investigators independently found, but revealed the number of people missing from the registry is several times higher than we initially knew. The promise.
It is a tool we do rely on.
Utah's online sex offender and kidnapping registry, which promises the most accurate and timely information.
So that is our responsibility. We recognize that.
But the KSL investigators found that wasn't the case.
That's scary. That is really scary.
0 offenders.
Nobody.
He's not on the registry. For more than a year, the KSL investigators reviewed Utah's registry, cross-referencing it with public records from Utah's parole board, online court records, inmate databases, and knocking on doors in Utah neighborhoods. Are you aware that he's not on the registry?
Obviously, this is an important issue for the public.
We found dozens of people missing from the registry, not because they didn't register, but because the state hadn't published them on the side of the registry the public sees. In response to our investigation, Department of Corrections Executive Director Brian Redd ordered an internal audit in October.
This is important information that needs to be accurate, and we're committed to that.
Their audit found 6% of offenders whose profiles should be published on the registry for the public to see are not. Let's do the math. This week, the department says there are 8,279 offenders on the registry. 6% is nearly 500 people. Redd says the audit did not determine how long this has been going on, but we know the registry has been incomplete for more than a year because we first alerted corrections officials there might be people missing from the registry back in July 2022. At the time, nothing changed, so we kept digging and working to verify what we found.
We're focused on moving forward and getting it right.
Redd, who was appointed to his role in May this year, said he's committed to addressing the issue now. He says there are several factors contributing to an administrative backlog and delays in publishing offenders' profiles for the public to see.
It appears it was underfunded,
including employee turnover in the unit.
Because the workload has been so heavy and overwhelming.
And that workload includes a lengthy verification process required to publish offenders on the registry.
Do we need to add more resources? Do we need to change processes? Do we need to streamline? We're looking at all of those things right now.
As a result of what the KSL investigators uncovered and what their audit confirmed, the department has hired on 4 temporary part-time employees to work through the backlog.
We're committed to getting every single individual that should be on the registry.
Even when an offender is on the registry, the KSL investigators found their information can be out of date or incomplete. Hundreds of offenders are currently listed as non-compliant with their location unknown. For some, it's simply a matter of not updating their information with authorities. But for others, the reason is much more concerning. The KSL investigators learned about this man, Christopher Law, in July. A convicted child rapist on parole had just been charged with raping another minor and disappeared. Days later, police indicated he may have fled to California. And a week after our initial report about Law, U.S. Marshals arrested him in Las Vegas. He's currently in the Utah State Prison, awaiting the next hearing in his pending child rape case and a review of his parole by the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole. The KSL investigators learned of another problem plaguing the sex offender registry: the complicated coordination between states when an offender reports moving out of Utah. Concerned Sandy residents contacted us after learning a California sex offender had been living in their neighborhood but was not on Utah's registry for more than a year. Police were notified, but prosecutors declined to file charges against Anthony Zaragoza for failing to register as a sex offender because by the time they got the case, he'd come into compliance. Then Zaragoza was removed from Utah's registry in August of this year after he reported he'd moved back to California. But a quick check of the address he'd given to authorities revealed he isn't actually a resident there. How does Department of Corrections verify that they are indeed moving back to California before removing them from our registry?
Well, we would typically interact with the California registry.
Utah's Department of Corrections tells us they have to rely on other agencies to confirm an offender's information out of state. As of now, Zaragoza's current whereabouts are unknown.
I don't know whether or not he's moved here or moved out of the area or not. He could very well be here and just said he moved out of state.
You feel like the parole board failed you?
Oh, 100%. Within 2 years, he's already reoffended.
When we come back, treat and release: how Utah's Department of Corrections weighs the risks of releasing sex offenders into the community. Plus, the change coming to Utah's Board of Pardons and Parole following a KSL investigation. Utah's corrections system is responsible for treating and releasing people who commit sex crimes. But after a convicted rapist was accused of committing another violent rape just 45 days after getting out of prison, we wanted to know, how do authorities weigh the risks of releasing offenders back into our community? Surveillance cameras at Richfield High School captured this red truck prowling the parking lots in December 2021. Zoom in here, and the picture is grainy as a cheerleader gets in her car. The teenage girl later reported to police that a man parked next to her asked to buy her underwear for $30.
And all I could think is, thank God she did not get out of that car. Thank God. Because if she did, I don't know what would have happened to her.
Inside that red truck was 43-year-old Christopher Peck. Just 13 months earlier, Utah's Board of Pardons and Parole released Peck after he served time for sexually abusing Jessica Black.
It was terrifying.
In January, Susan reported another recently released sex offender, Christopher Browning, brutally attacked and raped her in her home less than 45 days after his release on parole.
He kept telling me over and over again, I'm a monster.
Susan befriended Browning through her work as a prisoner advocate, and they were meeting for the first time when he learned there was a new warrant for his arrest. She says he snapped.
The first thing he said is, well, since I'm going back to prison, I'm going to make it worth my while.
Jessica was just 12 years old when she was assaulted.
It was, my best friend's stepdad. He should have protected me, and yet he assaulted me.
Susan was 72.
It can happen to anyone at any age. I'm living proof of that.
While Susan and Jessica's stories have stark differences, they both involve sex offenders, each with prior victims who were treated in prison and then released. Browning served 24 years of a 5 to life sentence. Peck served 11 of a 1 to 20-year sentence. Susan believes it was the treatment that failed.
No one, to me, is irredeemable.
Jessica says it was Utah's parole board.
For them to release him after all the other times he's offended is very shocking.
The KSL investigators looked into both.
We know that the majority of these individuals, over 90%, are going to return to our communities.
Andrea Parrish is the director of programming at Utah's Department of Corrections, and Lena Gustafson is deputy director. They say things have improved since a 2016 legislative audit of the program revealed a significant backlog, poor oversight, and failures to adopt evidence-based practices. But there are limited resources. Browning served 20 years before he had the opportunity to start treatment. The Department of Corrections says that timing was strategic.
We try to prioritize people to receive that treatment in the order that they're going to be released.
At the new prison, the agency says there are about 50 people waiting to start Utah's core sex offense treatment program, multiple therapy sessions a week for 8 months. Parrish says they want that treatment to be fresh as people are released.
Look at the recidivism rate.
Utah measures recidivism over 3 years. The department said the most recent data it could provide is from 2018. Of 453 sex offenders released that year, nearly half returned, mostly for parole violations. 2.4%, or 11 people, were convicted of a new sex crime. As for those who do reoffend,
I would say the treatment failed them.
Utah's powerful Board of Pardons and Parole has the ultimate say on who gets out of prison and when. In 2021, Browning told the board he'd likely need long-term treatment.
I need to be in aftercare probably for the rest of my life.
And yet he was released.
At a 2010 hearing, the board revealed Peck admitted to victimizing several more children in incidents that were never charged.
Until I get the help to change the way I'm thinking, I should not be released from prison.
He was released a decade later after completing treatment.
So the police officers did their part, the judge did their part. The only people that let us down was the parole board.
Another legislative audit released in November says Utah's Board of Pardons could better ensure public safety is appropriately prioritized and should improve transparency. But the board has denied several interview requests from the KSL investigators, instead releasing statements noting that both Peck and Browning served sentences longer than Utah's sentencing guidelines recommended, and that both completed sex offense treatment.
Right now, it's just very frustrating because we don't ever get answers.
It's just an educated guess. We're using our assessments, we're providing good quality treatment that's individualized, and then we have to take the risk.
The system is tasked with making sound decisions, but there is no crystal ball, and sometimes that risk leads to new victims. Jessica Black asked decision makers to consider them at Peck's last parole hearing.
You need to look at every child and ask yourself, is this his next victim? Can you own that guilt? You need to be accountable for that if you release that again.
A closer look at the Christopher Browning case revealed a shocking misstep in his release from prison. Our investigation found Utah's parole board did not have a complete picture of Browning's criminal history before making its decision to grant his parole.
Christopher Browning spent 24 years inside Utah's prison for breaking into a woman's home in 1998 and raping her. Just 1 month after his release in December, Susan says Browning violently attacked and raped her.
It was very brutal, very cruel.
Susan, in her 70s, had befriended Browning through her work as a prisoner advocate. She knew Browning had gotten into fights in prison, and audio recordings from his parole hearings reveal Utah's parole board knew that too.
That I do still have an anger problem that I need to address.
And yet he was released.
But Utah's Department of Corrections confirmed to the KSL investigators that the parole board did not know about Browning's recent felony assault case. According to court documents, prison surveillance video shows Browning charged 2 inmates, knocking them both to the ground. One hit his head on the concrete and was knocked unconscious. Browning is then seen punching 2 more inmates. The documents say that all happened in May last year. but the charges weren't filed until June this year. So the KSL investigators asked, why the delay?
I think we have to remember that these aren't the only cases the DA's office is prosecuting. It's not the only cases investigators are investigating.
Tyler Johnson is the Utah Department of Corrections Law Enforcement Bureau Chief. He blames workflow and technical issues, saying they tried to submit the case to prosecutors last July, but the Salt Lake County District Attorney's Office had switched to a new case management system.
There's this workflow loop, right? You follow up on your case and then you move on to others and then you get back to it. So, just that time between those follow-ups to see if they got the information they needed, finding out they didn't, and then reattempting probably caused some of that delay.
In a statement, Salt Lake County DA Sim Gill told us the case was properly uploaded to their system in June of this year, and within 6 days, they screened and filed the case. During those months of delays, Johnson says corrections officials failed to notify the parole board about the investigation and the pending case before Browning was released.
A communication breakdown.
Is it possible that had they received that information as they were considering his release, they might have made a different decision?
Oh yeah, it's always possible. And I don't want to speculate on what decision they would have made. Typically they could, rescind his parole date, push it out farther. It's hard to say.
A policy change now requires Utah's Board of Pardons and Parole to be notified of any law enforcement investigation into an inmate within 2 business days. And more change at Utah's Parole Board is in the works after another KSL investigation. In Utah, victims of crime have the right to be present and to be heard at parole hearings. But we found the board has repeatedly failed to notify victims about their perpetrators' hearings. Tonight, there's a plan in place to fix that problem.
What I've done in the past, I can never change.
In his recent parole hearing, 44-year-old Christopher Peck asked for another chance.
I'm not a predator.
He's a convicted sex offender. The last 2 times the parole board granted his release, he landed back in prison after committing new sex crimes.
And I'm working on changing myself so that never happens again.
He is dangerous.
Jessica Black is a survivor. It's Peck's sentence in her case keeping him in prison for now.
I want them to know, if you have a child, would you let him be in the room with a child? If that's the question you are going to say no to, you should rethink your decision.
But Jessica says the board has repeatedly failed to notify her about hearings, including in 2020 when it last decided to release Peck.
At that time, the victim had not received proper notification from the board.
3 years later, during this hearing in September, Jessica's mom read a statement on her behalf.
I'll be reading her statement as she was unable to make it because of lack of notification of the hearing.
How did you learn about Christopher Peck's latest hearing?
From you. If you hadn't have reached out, we would have missed another hearing. And most likely he would be out right now.
Brenda Black says in the 15 years they've been involved with the criminal justice system, they've only been notified of a hearing twice.
That's a failure. If they have no notification, how can they tell the court or the parole board how it's impacted them?
Utah's Board of Pardons and Parole Administrative Director Jennifer Yim told us the board doesn't currently have a system to track its victim notification efforts, and that needs to change.
I think that the Board of Pardons needs to improve its services to victims of crime and to do a better job over time managing that communication and honoring their wishes.
Yim has been on the job for about 4 months and says the board needs to create a victim-centered data management system.
After we've had it in place for a year, I'll be able to give the public the kind of transparency that it deserves to see how many times the board has been unable to contact someone or has fallen down or been successful in its communication.
Brenda says she's not optimistic, but hopes to be proven wrong.
When they do that, I will be the first one to say they did a great job. But until that time, they need some improvement.
Yim told us the new system could be online within a year, and she believes it can be done with existing funds and resources.
Could have been prevented. I truly believe that.
Still ahead, how significant gaps in Utah's criminal justice system are failing to protect the public from repeat offenders, and why one potential solution keeps stalling on Utah's Capitol Hill.
At some point, it has to stop, but it doesn't seem to be stopping.
10 years.
It could have been prevented. I truly believe that.
12 accusers.
My story could have been prevented.
5 law enforcement agencies.
We are enabling this. Our justice system has created
many victims.
One suspect, 27-year-old Joshua Homer.
The KSL investigators identified and tracked the cases of a dozen women who went to police and reported a sexual assault. Only 2 of their reports resulted in charges. These cases represent women and girls who put their trust in Utah's justice system. And over, we found instances where police failed to fully investigate.
Enforcement just doesn't seem to care.
These women told us they felt blamed, talked out of reporting, and even ghosted by law enforcement after coming forward.
It's been 2 years, and I have not heard anything from them.
Bailey Steed is one of 2 women who went to the Davis County Sheriff's Office in 2020 and reported they were raped by Homer. Both were interviewed, but that was it.
Did they connect you with a victim's advocate or any type of services?
They did not.
Did they give you information where you could go to get free counseling?
They did not.
It wasn't until we asked to interview Sheriff Kelly Sparks about the 2 cases that both women got a call back from detectives. The sheriff did not agree to an interview, but his office sent us this statement saying the cases were wrongfully closed, resulting in a delay in justice for which they are sincerely sorry. And after questions from the KSL investigators, both cases have now been reopened.
Is this an example of a law enforcement agency failing victims?
Absolutely.
Justin Boardman is a retired Utah detective who now trains police in trauma-informed investigating.
And if it's happening here, it's happening in other places.
We found a similar failure at another agency, a report of rape to Roy Police, also in 2020, still listed as open and active, despite the accuser telling us she hadn't heard from anyone in years.
We're going on 2.5 years here.
That's insane.
According to Roy Police Chief Matthew Gwynn, an internal investigation launched after the KSL investigators reached out revealed employee turnover and workflow processes complicated the amount of time it took to investigate the case. And the woman in that case has finally been contacted by a detective.
I said no, and it still happened.
This woman reported she was raped to a Utah County Sheriff's deputy in February 2022.
He said, okay, but, you let him into your room.
Asking, why did you invite that person to the room is certainly victim blaming.
I do remember feeling like, okay, so is it my fault?
Her case was then assigned to one of the agency's Special Victims Unit detectives who picked up the phone.
How long do you think that second phone call was, if you had to guess?
Less than 5 minutes, I'm sure.
He then wrote in his report, it was decided that this case would be closed as informational only.
I would say it was decided by the detective, and I agreed to it.
So when victims in these type of circumstances call up, we have a very open and honest conversation with them. It is sometimes a discouraging conversation.
Lieutenant Jason Randall oversees investigations at the Utah County Sheriff's Office. Well, he never spoke to this victim. He says the detective told him she was not ready to move forward.
We have to have our victims in a state of mind that when they come forward, they're ready to do battle with us, because that's what it becomes. It becomes a battle through the criminal justice system that is not kind to victims.
I wasn't sure if I even wanted to press charges at the time, but it didn't seem like I had much of an option or if it was worth doing.
It's not acceptable at all.
And it's not considered best practice by law enforcement and legal experts around the country who say an interview and investigation should always be conducted. Investigators should never give the impression the case will not be prosecuted, and they shouldn't pressure the victim to make decisions during the initial stages of the investigation.
You take the report, you have the survivor come in, and you talk with that survivor and listen to their experience. That's procedural justice. And that is something that we are horrible with.
8 months after Utah County closed this woman's case, Vanessa Clark reported to them that she too was assaulted by Homer.
I can't believe that he was able to do what he did.
Her report, the very thing other women tell us they tried to prevent by coming forward months and years earlier.
The pain in her eyes, I could see it and I could feel her pain. And it was very hard to watch.
I didn't want anyone else to have to experience what I had, but I felt like I did what I could. I reported. Just feels like it's never enough.
Because of our investigation, Davis County reopened its 2 cases, as well as a 3rd case. Roy PD took a new look at its case, and tonight, Joshua Homer is facing 5 new charges of rape across multiple counties. The Roy case is still under investigation. Homer is in prison now, serving a 0 to 5 year sentence after violating his probation in a separate sexual assault conviction. In the last 10 years in Utah, just 12% of the more than 13,000 rapes reported to law enforcement led to rape charges. Some reports led to lesser charges. Many others lead to no charges at all. Prosecutors tell us Utah's law and what's required to prove it are a problem. But we found repeated attempts to fix it have gone nowhere on Utah's Capitol Hill.
Listen up. If you're in Utah or a woman in Utah or
likes, shares, and comments.
After finding out that no charges were going to
This is what some survivors of sexual assault say it takes to be heard.
I want his name and his face out there so that no one else has to fall victim to him.
Because even when they call police right away, even when there's DNA, it's often still not enough.
And he just said that due to insufficient evidence, they weren't going to press charges.
Rayleigh Wadsworth says she did everything Utah's criminal justice system asks of victims of sexual assault.
We went straight to the hospital and had like a rape kit done and everything and talked to police.
Last September, she reported to police that a tattoo artist named Steve invited her to hang out, pressured her to drink, then used electrical tape to bind her wrists and ankles and raped her. Court records show that Steve is actually James Eugene Fisher, a convicted sex offender. The KSL investigators caught up with Fisher at the Ogden courthouse earlier this month, where he was being sentenced in a different case for skirting the state's sex offender registry requirements.
One of your clients says that you raped her. Is that true?
He didn't answer any of our questions.
I just feel like it's easily just being dismissed because he just said he's not going to talk.
Despite immediate collection of DNA evidence and photo documentation of her injuries, the Weber County Attorney's Office declined to prosecute Rayleigh's case.
They couldn't prove whether it was consensual or not.
It's a similar story with Vanessa Clark, who called police in Utah County and had a forensic exam after her reported assault by a different man. Prosecutors declined her case too.
But they're among the most difficult cases, absolutely.
Utah County Attorney Jeff Gray says even with physical evidence, rape cases are hard to prove.
The more severe the injury, the better or easier it is for us to prove. The less severe injury, it's still evidence. It's not like ironclad evidence.
As written, Utah's first-degree felony rape statute appears to apply to cases like Rayleigh and Vanessa's. But prosecutors say case law and interpretation by the courts means whether or not they can charge a person often hinges on the issue of consent.
We have to prove that he should have been aware of her non-consent.
What gets missed in that analysis is a common trauma response to sexual assault.
I just let it happen because I was so scared to fight back.
Tonic immobility is a physical and neurological response that prevents victims from resisting.
Prosecutors and officers and advocates need to understand that's very common.
Donna Kelly spent decades prosecuting sex crimes. She says it's time for change.
How about if we assume as our society that we don't want people penetrating our bodies when we haven't expressed that that's what we want?
Kelly supports a bill Utah Representative Angela Romero worked on with leading sexual violence researcher Dr. Julie Valentine. The legislation would introduce the idea of affirmative consent, creating a new third-degree felony charge for cases where a perpetrator fails to get consent from a victim through words or actions.
We have taken this to the legislators for 3 years and have failed every time.
And they don't understand that in many situations, a person freezes, so they don't say no, so they don't say yes. And that means that they didn't give consent.
The last time the issue of affirmative consent got a hearing in the legislature was in 2021, and 6 of 11 lawmakers voted no, killing the bill in committee. Opposition to the bill during that hearing included concerns that false reports would be prosecuted, despite decades of credible research showing false reports of sexual assault are extremely rare, between 2 and 8%. And experts tell us that's the same false reporting rate as any other crime.
The credibility of accusers is very often discounted.
Law professor Deborah Turkheimer has studied affirmative consent laws in 3 states where it's already on the books.
The cases that are brought in these jurisdictions, if anything, involve sleeping victims intoxicated victims, extremely intoxicated victims, and victims who are either in fear or very surprised, but not the kind of confusing communication and mixed signals that opponents of affirmative consent tend to worry about.
Did you find any negative consequences to affirmative consent legislation in practice?
No, I think it's really difficult to make the case that we shouldn't move toward a world in which affirmative consent is the norm.
She says law reform alone isn't enough.
No matter what the laws are, if survivors aren't believed, none of these cases are going to go forward.
Adopting affirmative consent law here could mean fewer sexual assault cases in Utah reach the same devastating dead end.
And they've decided that they will not be pressing charges due to insufficient evidence. Since posting that,
leaving survivors trying to protect others when they say Utah's justice system fails.
I'm getting all this support and all this help from so many people, but not from the people that actually can do something about it.
Representative Romero tells us she plans to run another affirmative consent bill during the 2024 legislative session.
When the AG's office contacted me and said that they would pick up my case, it was the biggest relief ever.
I would not recommend them touching one more survivor's case.
Up next, it's a process only Utah has, but are second look reviews of sexual assault cases working as lawmakers had hoped? Why some survivors say they feel failed by the system a second time. Plus, how the group tasked with protecting victims says it's failing Utahns too. In Utah, a unique process exists to give victims of crime a second shot to seek justice. Here's how it works. Any first-degree felony case that county attorneys decide not to prosecute can be sent to Utah's Attorney General's office for a second look. And our team found every case submitted so far involves sexual assault. And the reviews of how the process works are mixed.
He seemed like a normal guy.
A date turned violent.
I was sexually assaulted and choked. I feared for my life that night.
Riley Ray reported to police immediately, got a forensic exam, and soon learned she was one of several women accusing the same suspect.
That was just like mind-blowing. That's a good girl.
But nothing compared to what she felt when Box Elder County prosecutors said they couldn't move forward with her case.
And they called and said that there was no case, that there was no evidence.
In decades past, that decision by a local prosecutor marked the end of the road for survivors seeking justice.
They told me there wasn't anything I could do, and I had to move on.
But Riley's dad, Paul Ray, was a state legislator who pointed her to Utah's newly created second look process.
When the AG's office contacted me and said that they would pick up my case, it was the biggest relief ever.
The AG's office found additional victims and charged Braden Brailsford in the sexual assaults of 7 women and girls under the age of 20. Thanks to that second look, he's now convicted as a serial rapist, serving 20 years to life in prison.
Horrific stuff.
Yes.
And y'all got him.
Yes.
Che Arguello is the dedicated second look prosecutor in the AG's office. He says since 2019, they've reviewed cases involving at least 66 accusers. They've closed or declined 35 cases. Several are still under review. They've filed charges against 4 men. Many cases, few charges. But Arguello says that's to be expected. By the time the reports reach him, he says they've already gotten a careful look.
I think the value in 281 should be measured not in the number of cases that we file, but by the process itself and the ability for victims to have a different set of eyes with significant experience look at the case.
Arguello says the AG's office is a safe space for survivors of sexual assault, and Riley found that to be true.
The first thing that Che ever said to me was, "You can do this, and I believe in you."
But several other women tell the KSL investigators they had a different experience.
I felt so betrayed through this whole thing.
Tabitha Bell once championed House Bill 281, but now
I would not recommend them touching one more survivor's case.
Tabitha says her experience was traumatic and at times inappropriate.
I remember Craig Barlow asking me, have you had any other sexual partners? You can tell me, even if you're not going to tell your mom. I can keep a secret.
That interview, conducted by Justice Division Director Craig Barlow, was not recorded, but Barlow and 3 other AG employees who were in the room created written statements about what happened, most dated between 4 and 6 months later. Tabitha says these statements misrepresent what happened that day, including this claim by Barlow that Tabitha requested her victim advocate leave the room. In a sworn statement, the advocate said that claim is 100% false.
Did you request that she leave the room?
No, not at all.
Tabitha did not ask for the victim advocate to leave the room.
Attorney Greg Fairbrush was also in the room representing Tabitha. Tabitha and Fairbrush say after Barlow directed the victim advocate to leave, he surprised them by reading a graphic account of the reported assault from the suspect's perspective, who had claimed it was consensual. An experience Tabitha says was more harmful to her mental health than the assault she originally reported to police.
So overwhelmed with everything that I had been told, what I had been through in the interview, how it had been handled, how I felt not believed.
The AG's office declined to prosecute Tabitha's case, and Arguello wouldn't discuss it with us, or the case of another woman who also requested a second look.
They bungled this.
Attorney Jana Tibbetts says her client tried to use the new process but was afraid of retaliation from her attacker. A man Murray City's police chief even warned in this letter was considered high risk. Tibbetts says because of that fear, they asked to be alerted before investigators contacted the man. During a phone call with Barlow that Tibbetts recorded, they were told,
"We may or may not have to talk with them, but we're not going to give you that kind of information."
Tibbetts says her client didn't feel safe moving forward and withdrew her case. The suspect was later arrested in Idaho, charged with shooting 2 police officers.
There's consequences for not having a system that is hospitable or even remotely sensitive to victims.
Our work with victims is critical. That really is the heartbeat of any case that we want to advance to justice.
Patty Powers is a former prosecutor who now helps train and teach best practices for prosecuting sexual assaults.
There usually is not a reason to ask victims about sexual history. If victims want to have advocates present, they should be present. We need to respect all of their rights, the right to information, the right to notification.
If a survivor leaves the House Bill 281 process feeling wronged, feeling re-traumatized, feeling, I wish I'd never done this, who's responsible for that?
I am. At the end of the day, it's my decision. I make decisions not on who's going to be happy or disappointed by the decisions I make. I make decisions by what I believe is the right thing to do.
Our investigation revealed both Tabitha and Jana's client filed formal complaints about their experience with the AG's office with Utah's Council on Victims of Crime. That council is tasked with protecting victims' rights, but even they say their process is failing Utahns.
This process is not working. Direct is our goal, and anything which would be the opposite of the runaround, because we know that victims are getting that, and that's unfair, and that is on us.
Avremi Zippel chairs the council and says its investigation into Tabitha's complaint did not follow Utah law. Overall, Zippel says the council lacks the teeth to take action on any investigative findings. The council spent hours drafting a revised process in June. Zippel said they're pushing for clarity for victims, but they also want more power to hold those in the system accountable when victims' rights are violated. And they might need an act of the legislature to get it. Provo Representative Tyler Clancy told us he's working with the council to draft legislation for the upcoming legislative session. If you or someone you love has experienced sexual violence, help and support is available right now. The number for Utah's 24-hour sexual violence crisis line available there on your screen. We'll be right back. The KSL investigators are continuing to dig into gaps at all levels of Utah's criminal justice system and look for solutions to protect the public. If you see a problem we should investigate, send me an email at Daniela@ksl.com. In 2023, the KSL investigators filed more than 24 investigative reports in the Failure to Protect series, far more than we could show you in this hour. Before we go, we want to take a moment to honor the many women who shared their personal stories in the hopes that this work could affect change. Thank you.